Friends, so in this last series of first unit of understanding international foreign exchange markets under international financial management, we will understand two important theorems. These theorems and theories are purchasing power parity and international Fisher effect. While talking of purchasing power parity, it will be taught in absolute as well as relative aspect. And lastly, we will talk about the international Fisher effect postulates proportionality relationship between two countries' exchange rate and the nominal interest rate prevailing in the two countries at that point of time. Let us now talk about purchasing power parity. Let's first discuss the origins of the purchasing power parity theory. The term purchasing power parity was originated by Kessel in 1918, but he presented his PPP theory nearly 3 years earlier using the equivalent term theoretical rate of exchange in 1916. While many credit Kessel as the originator of PPP theory, some observers consider the founders to be the English economists writing at the time of the floating pound during the so-called bank reconstruction period, which is 1797 to 1821. Specifically, they credit Whitley writing in 1803 with the earliest complete formulation of the theory. Other writers assert that the theory was anticipated even earlier. Kessel was the first economist to place purchasing power parity within a systematic framework so that it clearly became an operational theory. As noted by Winner, Kessel was the first to express the theory in terms of statistical averages of prices. Not only did Kessel make PPP an operational theory, he was also the first to test it empirically, and he certainly was the most active proponent of PPP. Most impressive of all, Kessel's theoretical analysis and empirical test of purchasing power parity are remarkably similar to those current in later periods up to and including the present. Therefore, Kessel's contribution and not those of preceding writers are the earliest analysis and applications of purchasing power parity discussed here. Let us now talk about absolute price parity. Kessel's theory of purchasing power parity is appropriately named, for its foundation is the idea that the value of a currency and therefore the demand for it is determined fundamentally by the amount of goods and services that a unit of the currency can buy in the country of issue, that is, by its internal purchasing power. The latter is defined as the inverse of the price level for goods and services. With this statement applying to two countries, the value of one country's currency relative to the others is the short-run equilibrium exchange rate, and the ratio of the internal purchasing power or price level defines the absolute purchasing power parity, also called PPP-ABS. Thus, a theory of absolute price parity results. The internal purchasing power of a currency is sometimes referred to merely as its purchasing power and is called buying power or paying powers in Kessel's early writings. It is clear that the price levels used to define the absolute FTP are general price levels of the countries, representing prices of all goods and services available for purchase. Kessel is explicit on this point. Indeed, he is emphatic that only a general price level can represent the purchasing power of money in a country, and that price measures limited to traded goods that is exports and imports, are unsuitable. Moreover, Castle describes the process whereby an exchange value for a country's currency below or above the purchasing price parity leads to an increase or decrease in demand for the currency, followed by an increase or decrease in its commodity exports and a decrease or increase in its commodity imports. Thus, the ability to use currency to purchase goods and services in the country of issue is the foundation of Castle's purchasing power parity theory. So, he notes that the theory works best as the short-run equilibrium exchange rate is expected to have minimum deviations from the purchasing price parity under conditions of free international trade. Castle also states that the theory holds when trade restrictions are of equal severity in both directions, that is, on both imports and exports of a country. Castle's justification of absolute price parity has not been superseded to the present day. Both the critics and supporters exposit the theory in terms of virtually indistinguishable from those of Castle. Under the extreme conditions outlined by Samuelson and others before him, the existing exchange rate, whether freely floating, managed floating or pegged, cannot deviate even infinitesimally from the purchasing power parity, except to the extent that there are imperfections in the arbitrage process. In contrast, Castle's absolute price parity does not rely on the unrealistic assumption that all commodities are traded and without transport costs, tariffs or quantitative restrictions. In particular, the theory accepts the fact that there are non-traded goods, but notes that the prices of traded and non-traded goods are closely related through various links. Haberlin, although critical of purchasing power parity, describes its basis correctly. The proposition that general price levels in different countries are connected through the prices of internationally traded goods is the foundation of the purchasing power parity doctrine. Now, talking about relative price parity, Castle's theory of relative, like that of absolute price parity, is consistently presented throughout his writings. The actual exchange rate in a base period, which for Castle must be a normal period, is multiplied by the ratio of proportionate changes in price levels in the countries considered. The result is the relative purchasing power parity in the current period. The ideal base period would be one in which the exchange rate is equal to absolute purchasing power parity. The question arises as to whether the purchasing power parity calculated in this fashion, that is, the relative purchasing power parity in the current period is equal to the absolute purchasing power parity newly calculated for this period. The answer is affirmative. According to Castle, only if the changes in the economies that occurred since the base period were purely monetary in nature. In this respect, Castle is at one with his critics. Winner writes, "The one type of case which would meet the requirement of exact inversely proportional changes in the price levels and in exchange rates would be a monetary change in one country which would operate to change all prices and money income in that country in equal degree, while every other element in the situation in both countries remained absolutely constant." Similar discussions of the case of proportionate changes in exchange rates and price levels with no real changes are provided by Samuelson, Vanek and Stern. Samuelson points out that this ideal result, founded on the neutrality of money, can occur only in the long run. In the short run and also in the long run, if ideal conditions are not fulfilled, real changes will take place in the economies and the relative purchasing power parity theory will not hold exactly. However, if the monetary changes dominate, the real changes, relative purchasing power parity still applies, although in an approximate fashion. This is certainly the position of Castle. Let us discuss how a change in the internal value of dollar affects its external value. Effects of a change in the domestic purchasing power of the dollar on the exchange value of that currency are illustrated in the diagram on the screen. In figure A, we have elastic demand curves, that is greater than unity, to indicate that the rest of the world has substitutes for American exports or alternative markets in which to purchase similar goods and services. This means that the rest of world is rather sensitive to slight changes in American export prices. It is assumed that inflation has already occurred in the US to send up general prices, including export prices. Before the inflation, American export prices were P and American exports to the rest of the world, that is imports by others, were OQ1. Given the initial world demand for American exports D1 as shown in figure A. After inflation, American export prices go up to P2, in response to which the world demand for American exports decreases to D2. That is a downward shift of the demand curve to the left. As a consequence, American exports or imports by rest of the world decreases to OQ2. Effects of a change in the purchasing power of a dollar on its exchange rate. This means that the world demand for dollar exchange also declines, for the simple reason that the rest of the world now has less payment to make to American exporters or creditors. From the American point of view, this means that the supply of foreign exchange decreases. Note the leftward shift of the supply curve in figure C. In figure B, the demand curves are drawn so as to have a price elasticity of less than unity, on the assumption that the United States does not find close substitutes for those goods and services offered by the rest of the world. It is also assumed that world export prices remain unchanged, no inflation abroad. Under these circumstances, the US finds the rest of the world a cheaper place in which to purchase, and consequently the American demand for world exports increases from D1 to D2 at the old price level P1 as shown in second. Imports by the US or world exports to US increases from OQ to OQ2. Note that while American imports have increased by Q1 Q2 in B, American exports have decreased even more, namely by Q2 Q1 in A. In other words, the US has a larger import surplus and export surplus from the standpoint of others. This excess of imports over exports is reflected in the upward shift of the demand curve in C, that is in the rise of American demand for foreign exchange. The American demand for world exports and therefore for foreign exchange far exceeds the world demand for American exports and therefore the dollar exchange. Accordingly, the domestic price for foreign exchange rises from P1 to P2 as shown in the figure C. A rise in dollar price of foreign exchange means a fall in the external value of the dollar, since Americans must now give up more dollars to get the same amount of foreign exchange. The low exchange value of dollar will stimulate American exports and discourage American imports until equilibrium is restored in the American balance of payments. Thus, a change in the purchasing power of a dollar due to domestic inflation can affect the external value of the dollar, and the balance of payments position will change with it. Now, the last topic for the session, International Fisher Effect. International Fisher theory states that an estimated change in the current exchange rate between any two currencies is directly proportional to the difference between the two countries' nominal interest rate at a particular time. According to International Fisher theory hypothesis, the real interest rate in a particular economy is independent of monetary variables. With the assumption that real interest rates are calculated across the countries, it can also be concluded that the country with lower interest rate would also have a lower inflation rate. This will make the real value of the country's currency rise over time. This theory is also known as the assumption of uncovered interest parity. According to generalized International Fisher theory, the real interest rates should be same across the borders. But the validity of generalized Fisher theory largely depends on the integration of the capital market. That is, the capital in the market needs to be free to flow across borders. Usually, the capital markets of the developed countries are integrated in nature. It has been seen that in the underdeveloped countries, the currency flow is restricted. The International Fisher theory is calculated by the following formula: E is equal to I1 minus I2 divided by 1 plus I2, which is equivalent to I1 minus I2, where E represents the percentage change in exchange rate. I1 represents the interest rate of country A, I2 represents the interest rate of country B. An example may help to understand the value of the theory. For example, if the interest rate of country A is 10% and that of country B is 5%, then the currency of country B should appreciate roughly 5% compared to the currency of country A. The International Fisher theory observation holds that a country with higher interest rate will also be inclined to have a higher inflation rate. So, in this last session of series of first unit of understanding international foreign exchange markets under international financial management, we tried understanding two important theories, purchasing power parity and international Fisher effect. While talking of purchasing power parity, we started with the origin of purchasing power parity, absolute purchasing power parity, relative purchasing power parity, limitations of purchasing power parity as recognized by Kessels, and lastly cost parity. In the end, the last theory we talked about the international Fisher effect, postulating direct proportionality relationship between two countries' exchange rate and the nominal interest rate prevailing in the two countries at that point of time. I hope this session would have been useful to you in understanding more about the fundamentals of international financial management better. Thank you.